At 81 years old, Loretta Daniels carried herself with the quiet elegance of a woman who had seen history change and helped change it, who had marched when the world told her to sit down, who had raised a daughter that now sat at the head of boardrooms, filled with men who once wouldn't give a black woman the time of day, and yet even with decades of strength and grace behind her, she didn't expect that on a calm, cloudless afternoon. After being honored as a guest at her daughter's gala, she would once again be forced to defend her worth and her dignity 36,000 feet in the air. She boarded the plane with no fanfare, wearing a deep navy blue church dress and low heels, clutching a black leather handbag and the first-class boarding pass that her daughter Ava Daniels, the founder and CEO of Daniels Tech, one of the most powerful and progressive AI companies in the country, had bought for her as a way to say thank you for a lifetime of prayers, protection, and presence. As Loretta sat in 1A, the very first seat by the window, a glass of water already on the armrest and her travel blanket folded neatly across her lap, she gazed out onto the tarmac with a calm that came from surviving far more than delayed flights and condescending glances. But her moment of peace was quickly disrupted when a flight attendant, tall, slim, wearing the kind of corporate smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, leaned down and said in a voice that hovered between patronizing and authoritative, "Ma'am, I believe there's been a mix-up with your seat. Could I see your boarding pass?" To which Loretta, polite and composed, handed over her stub without a second thought, assuming it was a routine check. But what followed was anything but routine. The attendant glanced at the pass, blinked, and without apology said, "Actually, we have another guest with this same seat. Would you mind moving to another one in the back so we can get everyone settled?" And before Loretta could process the insult in full, she heard the soft scuff of designer loafers behind her as a younger white man, maybe in his late 30s, with slicked-back blonde hair and an overconfident air, cleared his throat and stood next to the flight attendant as if ready to claim what was his eyes barely acknowledging Loretta's presence as he adjusted the strap on his expensive carry-on. Loretta looked up slowly, her voice gentle but unwavering as she said, "I'm sorry, but this is my seat, and it's paid for." To which the attendant replied with an exaggerated smile, "Of course, and thank you for understanding, but it's just easier for everyone if we can avoid a situation. Could you kindly move so we can stay on schedule?" And it was in that moment, in the way she was spoken to like a problem, like a burden, like a leftover nobody wanted to deal with, that Loretta felt the old ache in her bones rise again, the same ache she felt sitting in the back of segregated buses, waiting at counters that refused her service, the ache of always being asked to give up something that was rightfully hers just to make someone else more comfortable. And though she had every reason to raise her voice, she didn't. She sat a little straighter, held her gaze a little firmer and said, "I will not be moving from this seat, young lady. And I suggest you check your records properly before you continue making assumptions." And in that instant, several nearby passengers, many already sensing the racial undertone of the exchange, began paying attention, one even quietly starting to record the interaction on her phone. As Loretta's refusal drew an awkward hush over the first-class cabin, the flight attendant's smile thinned into irritation, and she walked briskly to the front of the plane, returning moments later with the flight manager, a middle-aged man with the defensive posture of someone who'd been called in to resolve a complaint but already decided who was right before hearing both sides. And he leaned down and said with clipped politeness, "Ma'am, we really need your cooperation so we can take off. If you refuse to move, we may need to deboard you and resolve this on the ground." And the tone, the threat, the implication that she, the black elder in the rightful seat, was the problem, lit a fire that had long been banked under years of grace. And without saying another word to them, Loretta reached into her handbag, pulled out her phone, and pressed the one name that would turn this entire situation on its head, Ava Daniels, who answered on the first ring. "Mama, what's wrong?" And Loretta, keeping her voice low but clear, said, "They're trying to make me move for a white man who wants my seat." To which Ava replied with a calmness that only came from knowing your power, "Stay seated, Mama, I'll handle this." And she hung up, not with panic, but with precision, already dialing her next call as the plane doors had not yet closed, while the manager continued to murmur hollow explanations and passengers whispered in disbelief. Ava Daniels, one of the top 10 black CEOs in the country, a former legal analyst turned tech titan, a woman whose influence stretched into corporate boards, government advisory councils, and the media, was already on the line with not one but 3 senior airline executives she had personal and professional relationships with. Her tone measured but thunderous, laying out the timeline of events, the receipts from the purchase, the video evidence being recorded in real time, and the very real consequences that would follow if her mother wasn't given the respect she had earned, stating plainly that this incident was not just about a seat, but about a company's culture, its treatment of black elders, and the systemic bias still embedded in customer service policies that default to white comfort over black dignity. As the clock ticked and tension simmered on the plane, Loretta sat unmoved, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her presence defiant in its stillness, while behind the scenes, corporate phones lit up like a switchboard at crisis level. PR managers were woken from naps, regional directors were pulled from lunch, and one particular vice president of customer experience was heard saying, Do you know who her daughter is? Fix this now. And within minutes, a ripple of sudden movement began on the tarmac to men in suits, not in airline uniform but corporate badges swinging from their necks, marched up the jet bridge with urgency, stepping into the cabin, and, with practiced calm, approached Loretta's seat, not to remove her, but to apologize in front of the same staff who tried to silence her, saying clearly, "Mrs. Daniels, we are deeply sorry for what has occurred. There has been a serious error and it is being corrected immediately," before turning toward the white passenger who still lingered nearby with visible confusion and saying firmly, "Sir, please gather your belongings and exit the aircraft. We'll accommodate you on another flight." And when he began to protest, the suits didn't flinch, escorting him off as passengers stared in silent awe. The manager and flight attendant left standing, red-faced and trembling as whispers of, "That's her daughter Ava Daniels," moved through the cabin like a wildfire. And as Loretta adjusted her blanket and sipped her water, she glanced toward the aisle, where yet another man in uniform stepped aboard, this time not airline staff, but Federal Aviation Security, who quietly took statements and then asked the manager and flight attendant to also gather their things and follow him off the plane for further questioning. And as they exited, a round of applause erupted from the cabin, not just for the removal, but for the woman who dared to sit still when the world told her to move. The woman whose refusal to shrink reminded everyone that dignity isn't something you earn with status, it's something you demand with presence. And as the plane doors closed and the aircraft finally pulled away from the gate, Loretta gazed out the window, the weight of history behind her and the wind of justice finally at her back, knowing her daughter's voice wasn't just powerful. In boardrooms it echoed through institutions, policies, and people, and it would not be silenced. The story that had unfolded on Flight 2271 was no longer just an incident, it had become a nationwide reckoning. The quiet revolution stitched into the fabric of a viral video, news headlines, and morning talk shows, as Ava Daniels sat in her penthouse office atop Daniels Tech's shimmering headquarters in Atlanta, watching news anchors dissect what had happened to her mother with the fervor of courtroom analysts breaking down a civil rights case in real time, though her phone buzzed non-stop with texts of support and emails from journalists begging for exclusive statements. Ava's expression remained calm, controlled, focused, because for her, this wasn't about publicity, it was about principle, legacy, and the promise she made to her mother decades ago, when she was just a girl watching Loretta scrub other people's floors while humming gospel to drown out the pain of being overlooked, disrespected, invisible. And now, as one of the most influential black women in global tech, Ava Daniels was prepared to use every ounce of her power not just to make this right, but to make sure no other elder, no other black woman, would ever be asked to give up her seat again just to satisfy someone else's entitlement. By mid-morning, the video had over 20 million views, and hashtags like #NotHerSeat and #LORETTAS were trending across platforms, while commentators drew parallels to Rosa Parks, to systemic airline discrimination, to the arrogance still embedded in so-called service culture that defaulted to catering to whiteness even in first class. Ava, however, wasn't satisfied with symbolic justice. She wanted structural change, and that meant putting the airline on notice in a way they couldn't ignore. So she called her top legal counsel, Nyla Whitaker, a formidable Harvard civil rights attorney with a background in corporate litigation and fire in her voice, and within 30 minutes, they'd convened an emergency meeting with Daniels Tech's Diversity Council, brand reputation team, and a dozen other executives ever personally handpicked for their ability to strategize under pressure. Their war room table covered in files, flight manifests, screenshots, and a full timeline that clearly showed how Loretta was mistreated even after presenting valid documentation. "We're not just filing a lawsuit," Ava said, voice firm. "We're demanding federal inquiry into airline bias practices and leveraging this moment to launch our own flight equity index. Because if my mother can be treated like this in first class, what's happening to every other black woman sitting in coach?" And the room nodded in unified silence, ready for the battle ahead. Ava and Nyla worked through the night crafting a comprehensive civil complaint that would later be submitted not only to the airline's executive board, but also to the Department of Transportation, the FAA, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And when a prominent senator from Georgia caught wind of the issue, her office reached out directly, pledging support for public hearings on racial discrimination in air travel. Meanwhile, Loretta, having returned home, sat in her kitchen surrounded by flowers, fruit baskets, and letters from strangers, including one from a retired pilot who wrote, "Mrs. Daniels, you showed the grace and strength our industry should aspire to," though she humbly waved off the attention, choosing instead to pray and sip her sweet tea, occasionally pausing to smile when she saw herself mentioned on the news, not out of vanity, but because, in her own words, "It's nice to know I'm not invisible anymore." But Ava knew visibility wasn't enough. Not when the airline released a cold corporate statement blaming a technical glitch for the seat assignment and claiming no racial bias was intended. A statement that not only failed to apologize directly to Loretta but also downplayed the seriousness of what occurred. And that's when Ava escalated again. She sent a formal letter to the airline's board, demanding the immediate termination of the crew members involved. A live televised apology from the CEO, mandatory anti-bias training for all airline staff, and a commitment to overhaul their boarding policies or face a class action suit backed by her firm and several civil rights groups who had already reached out in solidarity. Her demands were met with initial resistance, especially from the airline's general counsel, who tried to delay negotiations by suggesting a private settlement and a signed NDA for Loretta. But Ava refused to budge, stating publicly on her verified social media, "My mother's dignity is not for sale, and her silence will not be bought." A post that gained over 500,000 likes in an hour and forced the airline stock to dip significantly as investors began asking questions about accountability. The airline's board, feeling the financial and reputational heat, scheduled a crisis response meeting with Ava and her legal team. And on the day of the meeting, Ava walked into their Manhattan headquarters wearing a sharp black pantsuit, heels clicking like war drums, flanked by Nyla and 3 other attorneys, her presence radiating not anger but power, the kind of power that couldn't be denied, deferred, or dismissed. The airline executives, mostly older white men in expensive suits, greeted her with strained smiles and hollow pleasantries, clearly unprepared for a woman who didn't come to negotiate, but to dictate terms. And as the room fell silent, Ava laid out a 3-point plan: 1. Public accountability and crew termination; 2. Policy reform and partnership with her firm to lead bias training; and 3. The establishment of the Loretta Daniels Air Equity Fund, a foundation paid for by the airline to support black seniors in travel and hospitality contexts, ensuring Loretta's name would outlive the insult. The executives balked, one even saying, "Ms. Daniels, don't you think this is a bit much for an unfortunate misunderstanding?" To which Ava replied, eyes steely and voiced low, "You didn't misunderstand my mother, you erased her, and now you'll remember her forever." And just like that, the tone shifted. The weight of corporate guilt pressed down on their shoulders like gravity, and they folded, agreeing to all terms under the threat of public exposure and Ava's pending media appearance with 3 major outlets, ready to break the full details of the incident. The following week, the airline CEO issued a live apology on national television, not from a press release but with Ava and Loretta seated beside him. And though the man stumbled through his words, it was Loretta's calm reply that stole the moment. "I forgive you," she said simply. "But I hope you've learned what it means to look someone in the eye and see them as human." And across the country, people wept, clapped, shared, reposted, and remembered. The crew members were officially terminated for violating dignity and inclusion standards, and the Loretta Daniels Air Equity Fund was established with an initial $15 million contribution, sparking similar programs across other airlines. Within the month, yet even in victory, Ava knew the fight wasn't over. Her mother had been asked to surrender a seat, and in response, Ava had pulled up a chair at every table that once tried to push them out, proving not just that she was unshakable, but that the power of a black woman standing for her mother could shake the entire system to its core. As the news spread like wildfire across every platform, media outlet, and living room screen, the incident on Flight 2271 no longer remained a personal affront. It had become a cultural reckoning, a flashpoint in the nation's ongoing conversation about race, respect, and power. And at the very heart of it stood Loretta Daniels, the graceful matriarch who had refused to be moved, and the daughter who had refused to be silenced. And now, in the aftermath of that infamous flight, the world watched as a quiet revolution unfolded, with Ava Daniels orchestrating every step, every maneuver, like a chess master backed by decades of experience, pain, and perseverance. Following the removal of the discriminatory staff and the CEO's very public apology, Ava didn't retreat or celebrate but instead pressed forward with renewed purpose, launching the Loretta Daniels Air Equity Fund with press conferences, fundraising events, and roundtable discussions featuring policymakers, civil rights advocates, airline executives, and everyday black travelers who shared stories of being overlooked, mistreated, and humiliated in airports and airplanes across the globe. Ava ensured that her mother's experience would not be a one-off media spectacle, but the beginning of a systemic shift. And as her mother's story resonated far beyond the black community, support poured in from all corners: students, politicians, celebrities, even retired pilots and flight attendants who confessed in anonymous op-eds how the culture of deference to whiteness had been quietly encouraged and baked into industry norms for decades. Meanwhile, Loretta herself, though overwhelmed by the attention, carried herself with the same humility and strength she always had, walking into interviews and community meetings with grace and quiet dignity, always deflecting praise with a chuckle and a soft, "I was just trying to sit in the seat my daughter bought me." Yet behind that calm exterior was a woman deeply proud not of the fame or the applause but of her daughter's unshakable courage, and privately she whispered during quiet moments, "Ava, your grandmother would be so proud." Words that Ava carried like armor. The impact grew so loud and widespread that other major airlines began reviewing their internal policies, some even reaching out to Ava and offering partnerships on equity audits and diversity training. while others scrambled in damage control mode, terrified of becoming the next viral scandal. And Ava, though cautious about aligning with corporations too eager to cleanse their image, accepted only those who met her full list of demands: no token gestures, no vague commitments, only actionable reforms and full transparency, because to her, this wasn't about publicity, it was about generational repair. Meanwhile, news documentaries were being developed, colleges requested Ava to speak at commencements, and civil rights museums began including the Loretta seat incident as a modern-day parallel to the Montgomery bus boycott, placing it under the growing archive of black resistance in transit spaces. Even Hollywood came knocking, and though Ava declined movie deals for now, she approved a powerful short film campaign narrated by none other than Viola Davis, titled The Seat She Wouldn't Surrender, a poetic and emotional reenactment of that fateful moment in the sky, narrated over images of black women through history refusing to bow, to move, to disappear. And as all this unfolded, the airline industry scrambled to keep pace. The FAA announced a new committee on passenger equity, citing Ava's campaign as the catalyst for overdue reform, and Congress introduced the Equal Air Access Act, aimed at protecting passenger rights and penalizing bias-driven seat removals, a move Ava publicly supported and helped draft behind the scenes alongside lawmakers and legal experts from the Daniels Foundation. But not everyone was pleased. There was backlash from those who felt Loretta had been overreacting or accused Ava of weaponizing her wealth and power, and some airline unions pushed back, arguing that crew members were being unfairly punished. But Ava, unfazed, responded with clarity and calm. This isn't about one crew, one passenger, or even one airline. This is about a system that assumes certain bodies are more valuable than others in elite spaces, and we are dismantling that assumption one seat at a time. And her words rang across morning shows, TED Talks, and think pieces, each echoing the same truth, that power, when wielded with justice, could shake the very structures built on exclusion. And while Ava handled the legal, political, and corporate fronts, Loretta continued to be the heart of the movement, invited to speak at churches, senior centers, and school assemblies, where children of all races rushed to hug her, whispering, "You remind me of my grandma," or "Thank you for standing up for us," to which Loretta always smiled, tucked their notes into her purse, and said softly, "Baby, I just wanted to sit where my daughter placed me." Her humility, more than Ava's strategy or the media's spotlight, we became the soul of the story, and it was that soul that inspired thousands to begin writing letters, calling airlines, filing complaints, even organizing peaceful sit-ins where black passengers booked first-class seats in groups and refused to be moved, no matter how politely they were asked. Ava, ever the visionary, saw this as a moment to launch a national awareness campaign, Seats of Dignity, encouraging marginalized travelers to claim space unapologetically, to document incidents, to know their rights, and to use the Daniels Foundation as a legal and moral backup whenever injustice surfaced again. And just when Ava thought things couldn't get more impactful, she received an unexpected call from the White House. The First Lady herself invited Ava and Loretta for a private meeting, where they discussed policy, legacy, and the quiet strength of black mothers. And at the end of the visit, the First Lady presented Loretta with a National Service Citation, recognizing her grace under injustice and the movement her quiet defiance sparked. Yet even as cameras flashed and awards stacked, Ava remained focused, continuing to build infrastructure for long-term change, hiring investigators to audit airline bias reports, partnering with app developers to build a real-time reporting system for flight discrimination, and funding scholarships for black youth pursuing aviation careers, ensuring that Loretta's story would not end in pity, but rise as a launchpad for future black pilots, executives, and CEOs who would change the sky from within. And amid all of this, perhaps the most moving moment came one morning when Ava received a handwritten letter postmarked from Montgomery, Alabama, signed simply, from the family of Rosa Parks, thanking her and her mother for reminding the world that dignity, once denied, must always be defended. A letter Ava framed and hung in her office beside the photo of her and Loretta on the day of the apology. The movement had begun with a demand for a seat, but had grown into a national roar of remembrance and reckoning, proving once again that when black women stand together, when they refuse to move, refuse to bow, and refuse to be erased, the world doesn't just watch, it changes. In the months following the seismic fallout from the flight that tried to diminish one black woman's dignity and underestimated another's power, the world began to understand that this wasn't just a news cycle moment but a foundational shift, one that reverberated through boardrooms, legislative chambers, and kitchen tables alike. And it was Ava Daniels who carried the torch forward, not as a symbol of vengeance but as a steward of transformation, channeling fury into structure, outrage into outcome, and her mother's pain into policy. And now, as she stood on the stage of the International Aviation Equity Summit in Geneva, gathering that had never before seen a keynote address from a black woman, CEO Ava's voice echoed across 1,000 delegates, recounting not only the incident that catalyzed the movement but also the years of silent indignities that preceded it. the murmurs ignored, the eyes averted, the biased assumptions masked as protocol, and in her hand she held the final draft of the Equity in Air Travel Act, legislation that had gone from dream to document to law thanks to her tireless advocacy, her alliances with global watchdogs, and her team's unyielding legal acumen. And as applause roared in acknowledgement of the reform's mandatory bias training for all flight staff, real-time discrimination reporting apps, passenger dignity rights, and minority hiring benchmarks across major airlines, Ava allowed herself a rare moment of pride, not for her name in headlines, but for the power of legacy, because sitting in the front row, resplendent in a navy suit and diamond brooch shaped like a pair of wings, was Loretta Daniels, whose refusal to move from seat 1A had rewritten global air policy and awakened a long-buried fury in travelers around the world, who had endured just enough to stay quiet until now. And that same week, Ava quietly finalized the purchase of a major regional airline through a partnership with other black entrepreneurs and equity funds, renaming it Daniels Air and launching it with a bold statement of intent: fair treatment at 30,000 feet wasn't an aspiration, it was a right. And for every person who had ever been made to feel less than in premium spaces, Daniels Air would be proof that respect could not be revoked, not for any reason, not anymore. And the inaugural flight, which took off from Atlanta and soared toward Los Angeles, was a moment that would be etched in history. The crew was majority black and brown. The flight was captained by the first openly queer black female pilot in the region. The in-flight menu featured meals by black chefs, and every seatback screen played a short film titled Legacy in the Sky, the Loretta Daniels story. And when the plane reached cruising altitude, Ava, who had flown on countless private jets and commercial cabins alike, quietly stood, walked to the intercom, and in a trembling voice thanked the passengers for believing in change, for riding with her toward a future that once seemed impossible. And she ended simply by saying, "To every mother who's ever been told her place isn't here, this airline belongs to you now." And in the cabin, people of all colors wiped tears, clapped, and some even stood just to feel what it was like to rise in solidarity. Meanwhile, the ripple effects continued as major airlines scrambled to match Daniels Air's ethical guidelines. Regulators enforced quarterly reviews of bias complaints, and flight schools saw a dramatic rise in black and brown applicants, many citing Ava and Loretta as their inspiration. And civil rights organizations now had templates, strategies, and data to combat racism in travel, all made available through the Daniels Foundation, which had grown from a small office in Harlem to a global network of equity advocates, policy advisors, and legal experts determined to make skies safer for the marginalized. But through it all, Ava never lost sight of the story's heartbeat, her mother. And when the Smithsonian invited them both to Washington to unveil the seat of dignity, a fully recreated first-class seat from that fateful flight, Loretta wept quietly as a crowd of thousands cheered her, not just as a passenger, but as a pioneer. And Ava, standing beside her, squeezed her hand and whispered, "This is all yours, Mama." And Loretta, always humble, always human, just shook her head and said, "No, baby, this belongs to everyone who refused to get off when they were told they didn't belong." And in that moment, the flashbulbs faded, the noise stilled, and what remained was a truth too powerful to be denied: that power used with purpose can remake the world, that dignity cannot be downgraded, and that when one black woman chooses to stand, whether by sitting, speaking, or soaring, entire systems have no choice but to come crashing down or rise to meet her.